Professors Taiwo and Byfield were sat down. Some kind of Nigerian conspiracy. We'd like to congratulate Professor Byfield. She just won a big award and she'll be leaving us next year, so this is an even more pleasant occasion. Congratulations, Professor Byfield. She's clearly a woman who can make an entrance. Good afternoon. I'm Professor Farrell. I teach in the Africana Studies and Research Center. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our event today. We'll have Professor Riche Richardson speaking on Rosa Parks and fitting. In a mode, the introduction of a colleague, especially one you admire, the mode of the introduction demands hyperbole. So I offer my remarks in nothing so much as a sense of gratitude for this convention. I am free to say what is needed because this is a colleague I can do, which I can offer this convention without artifice. I have immense regard for Riche Richardson, an associate professor at the Africana Studies and Research Center, who joined the department almost 5 years ago now from the University of California at Davis, the institution where she began her teaching career. She obtained her PhD from the English department at Duke University, and she would certainly reprimand me were I not to mention this, but she took her first degree majoring in English with minors in philosophy and women's study at Spelman College. So I feel like I have dispatched that duty, Professor Richardson. In Professor Richardson's case, it would seem that all roads begin and end in Montgomery, Alabama. She has just returned to campus from giving a talk on Rosa Parks in her hometown, but her career has taken her a great many places. North to Spelman, a little further to Durham, North Carolina, west to California, and meanwhile she has taken in much of America and Europe. She has wonderful stories to tell about her time in Paris. Always, however, she seems to me a figure deeply rooted in the South, as evidenced by the work she undertakes in her first monograph, Black Masculinity in the U.S. South, from Uncle Tom to Gangster, from University of Georgia Press in 2007. A new project currently under review at Duke University Press is entitled Presidential Encounters, Reimagining Black Femininity and the National Body. It is, of course, the work we look forward to seeing in print, but for me, more than that, it offers an entree into the ways in which Professor Richardson conducts herself as a scholar. I heard her present materials, work in progress, on another Montgomery native, Condoleezza Rice. Like I said, everything begins and ends in Montgomery. In this presentation, Professor Richardson was specific. She wanted to think about the ways in which Rice can be understood as a figure from the U.S. South. The questions in that session that followed predictably turned to the political. More specifically, Rice as a figure who, by her very presence as a black woman from the South, the argument went, lent a certain credence to the activities of the Bush regime. These were not unexpected questions, but, as Professor Richardson insisted rightly, this was not the focus of her project. She wanted to think Condoleezza Rice in a way that was particular to the South, particular to a certain race and very cultured milieu. I imagine playing piano was important, and Professor Richardson sketched that in her response, particular even, we might say, to a very specific black Southern sensibility, or gentility, we might be tempted to add. Firmly, she fended the questions, sometimes deflecting them, always stay in the course. She kept, as it were, Condi Rice in her place. I recall that encounter because it speaks to me of the essence of Professor Richardson, a scholar of integrity, to the project, to her work in general, fidelity to the goal, as it were. The prevailing winds, whichever way they might blow, mean little to Professor Richardson. She's open to critique while remaining felicitous. Her work is, we might say, a truth object. It is rare for one to be able to say that. I am glad that I can do so. In the spirit of intellectual felicity, let us return once more to Montgomery, to the Montgomery of the bus boycott, of the horrors of Bull Connor, to what some perceive as the birthing of the civil rights movement. It's coming relentlessly into public view. At the center of it all was a steadfast seamstress from Montgomery, a woman of impeccable moral standing in the black community in Montgomery. Let me just add parenthetically, Rosa Parks was not the first person to refuse to go to the back of the bus, but she was the only person that the civil rights movement, fledgling then as it then was, could get behind, but especially and only because of her impeccable moral standing. It is proper that Rosa Parks should today be the subject of a talk by one of our own, another steadfast, deeply principled native of Montgomery, Alabama. Please join me in welcoming Professor Riche Richardson, who will now take us on a journey to a favorite place in the South.
Thank you, Professor Barrett, for your wonderful introduction. Indeed, I must say that I owe Professor Barrett for the earliest architecture and form of this project. He was the first person really to nail it and underscore who should be the emphasis and the focus. So I really appreciate that, and it's a project that's continued on in some interesting directions. I find it to be very exciting to examine my subjects. I'm looking principally at what I think of as presidential encounters, or what I've also referred to as intimacies, that a range of black women in and across U.S. literary history can be said to have experienced. In the project, the main chapters focus on Mary McLeod Bethune, Rosa Parks, Condoleezza Rice, and First Lady Michelle Obama. And then the conclusion zones in on Beyonce. But the main concern of the project is to look at a kind of recurring sense with which black women have shaped the national body, which goes against the prevailing narratives of the black feminine body as abject. So that's the primary thrust of the project. And I'm also concomitantly examining the role of the U.S. South in shaping these feminine formations in the national arena. And in some instances, it's interesting to see that these images have also become global or have been dispersed into the global arena. But this notion of national femininity as constructed by the black feminine body is primarily my concern in the project at hand. I am heartened to see so many of you here this afternoon. Many thanks to Africana colleagues, staff, and students for coming out this afternoon, as well as community members here in Ithaca. I bring you greetings, yes, from Montgomery, Alabama, from Dr. Virgil Woods, who flew from Houston to attend Monday's glorious celebration of Rosa Parks' 100th birthday in Montgomery. He mentioned that he's very familiar with the Africana Center and knows Dorothy Cotton very well, and so wanted me to convey his greetings. This was a really wonderful celebration. It began with the reading of a letter from First Lady Michelle Obama, which was certainly very special. It was attended by Rosa Parks' family members from Atlanta, Georgia. The reading of the poem Red Velvet by the National Book Award recipient Nikki Finney was just phenomenal and moving. I encourage you to read her Head Off and Split, which includes that poem if you haven't seen it yet, but it was really a compelling presentation. I presented my talk, and we had so many other powerful moments during that time that I'll come to. One of the most special things that happened to me that night was that I was sitting next to on the next row from the Parks family, and a little girl at a certain point in the family, the youngest member, tapped me on the shoulder and passed me a note. And I looked around and saw that it was from this senior black woman who was dressed in a coat, a hat, glasses, bearing really a grace and dignity so reminiscent of the classic portraits of Rosa Parks that we know. And it said I worked with Rosa Parks, which to me underscores just how loved Rosa Parks was by her colleagues and how committed she was to work. And after the celebration, I went over and met her and her daughter. She kissed me right here. That note is one that I will treasure for the rest of my life. I am just really over the moon about that celebration. It was attended by many distinguished guests, including the mayor of Montgomery, his administration members, including a friend, Michael Riddell, administrators at Troy University, including the chancellor, and then our community members, some of my own family. This afternoon, I'm going to present the talk to you pretty much as I did in Montgomery, but in an extended version this time around. And I'll preface it with a prologue that I wrote to mark the occasion. And so bear with me, please, and then we can talk afterwards. Today, I give my talk in honor of the memory of Rosa Parks, along with her best friend and my great aunt, Montgomery Improvement Association leader Johnny Rebecca Carr, and the actor Nick Latour, the son of E.D. Nixon. I dedicate my discussion to Annie Bell and Benny Beasley, Alma Lee Jordan, Arlen Carr, Dr. Mary Frances Witt, Reverend Robert Gratz, and his wife Jeannie, who were her neighbors through Trinity Lutheran and are now my neighbors in Montgomery. My talk this evening draws on the second chapter of the book I'm finishing, a chapter entitled Rosa Parks, Presidents, and a Ride with Mr. Rivets. I could not be more excited and honored to be here today to celebrate and commemorate the 100th birthday of Rosa Parks. Because of her courageous and heroic choice on that bus, December 1st, 1955. Her action, through the choice to remain seated, birthed an international movement for civil and human rights that makes it fitting to think of her not only as the mother of the civil rights movement, but also as a person, a woman who changed the world. To this day, her example brings hope and inspiration to people everywhere, including many children. This year, we are remembering many anniversaries in the long history of the civil rights struggle, including inspiring events like the sesquicentennial of the Emancipation Proclamation and the March on Washington, as well as tragic losses that still scar our collective national consciousness, such as the loss of Medgar Evers, President John F. Kennedy, and the 4 little girls in Birmingham at 16th Street Baptist Church, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Denise McNair, and Carol Robertson. Rosa Parks, in part because this year also marks her 100th birthday, is another important figure to remember in the midst of our reflections. Not just today, but all this year especially, I feel that we are challenged to give thanks for how the birth of Rosa Parks made differences from which all of us continue to benefit to this day, and opened the door to an emancipation and great new possibilities for a new generation in a society that had been shadowed by Jim Crow and segregation, and in that sense, failed to realize fully the nation's democratic ideals. When Rosa Parks sat down, American democracy moved forward. To be sure, every day is a day for honoring, thinking about, and celebrating Rosa Parks, for me and for many others. It is wonderful to celebrate Rosa Parks at the 100th year of her birth and to savor the cultural celebrations that evoke a veritable Rosa Parks Renaissance. Yet, the real question is how we, by drawing on the extraordinary example that she gave us, can be reborn and renewed through our celebrations to go forward, to deal with the struggles and challenges we face at the dawn of this new millennium. What does that bus, perhaps the most famous bus in the world, mean for you, for me, for all? It is inspiring to imagine the beauty of a birthday cake illuminated by the candles and wisdom that come with the journey over 100 years and by the radiance of the soul and memory of one of the most remarkable people that the world has ever seen. We are challenged to think about how her legacy makes her a shining beacon and bright light on the road to freedom for all of us. On this road, we may not necessarily look north in this new millennium as an enslaved people once did. Yet, we still gaze upon various chains that need to be broken and hold people captive, whether in mind or in body, in today's world where we see both the best and worst in people. Walking forward with the faith and courage of Rosa Parks, we are challenged and inspired to draw on her great legacy to make a difference in the world and help make the world better. When we think in a concrete way about what it means to refer to her as the mother of the civil rights movement, though that title only partly reflected her truly global impact, we can recognize that collectively we are all her children and are challenged to carry her spirit forward in the best possible way. Rosa Parks, a woman who walked by her great faith in God, still lives in all of us, and the special light that she brought to the world shines brightly still. A beautiful student community and the Black Family Weekend program at the University of California, Davis articulated these connections powerfully on her birthday in 2006 through the statement on the t-shirts they had made for all of us to wear in her honor, which read simply, "I am because she was." Her legacy challenges us to remember the past as we reflect on and live in the present in order to envision a better future. Rosa Parks loved children, and it showed. From her days of working with the youth group in the NAACP with youth such as Mary Frances Witt, children were at the center, the very heart of Rosa Parks' lifelong mission. And when I think of that, I think of her love for them and how grieved she would have been by what happened in Sandy Hook. Moreover, when we think of the tragic losses of the children and adults in Sandy Hook, many of us cannot help but relate that kind of violence and terror that sad day in December to the tragic losses of the 4 young, innocent children at 16th Street Baptist Church. The decades of suffering left in its wake, the lives shattered, the dreams lost. The weight of the tragedy in Sandy Hook is upon us as well. And we will never forget. Rosa Parks would be concerned about Felicia Barnes, Trayvon Martin, Jordan Davis, and countless others. In general, civil rights continues to be a valuable and relevant context to draw on for thinking about, ministering to, and working to remedy the forms of suffering that exist in so many places for some children and many other people in and beyond the U.S. to make a better world. In some cases, parents and families will impart lessons on Rosa Parks and are in a privileged position that will allow them to do so. But it is our responsibility to ensure that all children, including boys and girls who live in more disadvantaged circumstances and environments, learn about this history and hear the amazing story of Rosa Parks. I was so inspired to see Georgette Norman go to London last May to meet with a diverse group of youth and to help teach and to celebrate the power and beauty of this story. As we stand on the cusp of the Jubilee year of 2015 to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the day that Rosa Parks famously took a stand and refused to give up her seat, let us move forward and carry forward her mission. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the Montgomery bus that fateful evening in 1955, she risked life and limb in resisting the authority of at least 3 white men in a Southern public space, including a bus driver, a passenger, and a police officer. In addition to humiliating her on the basis of race, being asked by the bus driver, James Blake, to give up her seat, insulted Rosa Parks on the basis of gender. Because black women were invisible within the category lady, it was defeminizing that she was expected by law to give up her seat to a white man on a public bus. Because she was a black woman, neither a white male passenger nor the bus driver had a social obligation to respect her or to treat her as would have behooved a gentleman of the time. Yet, Parks's body, as famously visualized in the now iconic black and white photo taken after her arrest, which shows her dressed in a suit, hat, and glasses with a pinned-up braided hairstyle replete with a flower pin, bore all the conventional gendered and sex significations of a lady, and underscores race alongside gender and sexuality as factors that made her legible on the bus as a public space. According to Parks' biographer, Douglas Brinkley, who draws on Parks' reflections, Blake directed most of his hostility and verbal tirades at black women. Such epithets are inflected by a host of race and gender pathologies and stereotypes. Long-standing ideologies of black female sexuality, traceable back to the era of antebellum slavery, a system that Hortense Spillers has notably argued ungendered black men and women, inflected the flagrant disregard for Parks on the bus given her status as a black feminine subject and a southern climate in which black women were not only frequently abused verbally, but also physically and sexually, as horrifically evident in the case of Riche Taylor, who was brutally gang raped by a group of 6 white men, including a serviceman in the U.S. Army in Abbeville, Alabama in 1944. Indeed, personal writings discovered in recent years recount Rosa Parks' painful memory of nearly being raped in 1931 by a white male neighbor for whom she was working. Gender and sexuality were both relevant to the situation on the bus, not only because it primarily counterposed Parks with 3 subjects who were white and male, but also because of what it meant as Parks stood under the gaze of a white man who had routinely made his disparaging estimation of black women evident. In the ensuing years, Rosa Parks' vulnerability as a race and sex subject, as well as sexual being, has typically been obscured in light of her universalization as a mother and this title's attendant desexualization. Moreover, the ways in which she confronted racism through her stand sometimes obscure the levels on which she also, in effect, confronted sexism that fateful December evening. A more expansive understanding of Rosa Parks that considers the complexity with which gender and sexuality played out in this moment, encompassing the gender categorizations encoded in the encounter's central figures from black and female to white and male subject identifications, is a useful backdrop against which to think about what I am arguing in my work has been her profound impact on national femininity in the U.S. This is a fascinating phenomenon in light of her black and feminine subject position and the prevailing exclusion and illegibility of such subjects in U.S. femininity's definition. This construction of Rosa Parks, which has primarily unfolded in the post-civil rights era, has been grounded in the recurrent scripts of her as a mother figure in the nation's public sphere against the backdrop of her global iconicity, including, by the end of the 20th century, her salient symbolic association as a public figure with the nation's capital and U.S. presidents, including the nation's founding fathers. Her presence with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at President Lyndon B. Johnson's signing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which promoted which prohibited discriminatory practices in voting that had disfranchised many blacks in the U.S. and alienated them from the political process, drew on her symbolic capital linked to the Montgomery bus boycott, including her emerging iconicity as the mother of the civil rights movement, anticipating the extent to which she would increasingly be represented as a mother for the nation as a whole in media representations and revered by later presidents ranging from Bill Clinton to Barack Obama. While Parks faced the threat of state violence on the night of her arrest, paradoxically, white and masculine figures associated with state authority in the figure of public officials such as President Bill Clinton and President George W. Bush, liberal and conservative presidents, respectively, have played a major role in publicly honoring her legacy in the post-civil rights era. In this sense, I am referring primarily both to her awarding of the Presidential Medal of Freedom and the Congressional Gold Medal of Honor under President Clinton's administration and the authorizations posthumously for Parks to rest in repose on the nation's capital under President Bush's administration and be honored through a statue on the Capitol. In the contemporary era, the prevailing narrative of Parks as a symbolic mother in the nation further consolidated and increased exponentially as such leaders, in effect, marshaled white masculine power and authority to celebrate, embrace, and affirm Parks' powerful and long-standing legacy of humanitarian work and association with freedom movements around the world, discrediting any lingering scripts of Parks as an enemy of the state from the 1950s and 60s. In other words, these new narratives, as developed in the post-civil rights era, thoroughly revised and displaced the facade that Parks encountered in the white masculine figures who represented state power on the bus that fateful evening. The consolidation and circulation of Rosa Parks as a premier icon of U.S. national femininity builds upon her figuring as a mother within civil rights and freedom struggles and has been mediated and facilitated in part by the levels on which a succession of ideologically diverse U.S. presidents both embrace and engage the discourses related to her in the U.S. public sphere. At the same time, and in spite of their importance and culturally transformative impact, they inevitably risk the routine and characteristic appropriation by state authority of activists such as Parks, who have been primarily linked to subaltern political movements. Critical epistemologies from areas such as Black feminism, transnational feminism, and gender studies are indispensable for thinking about the discourses on Rosa Parks related to how she, in effect, challenged notions of white male dominance, privilege, and superiority, along with attendant ideologies of Black inferiority in the subversive act of remaining seated, but also for pondering how profoundly the discourses related to her unsettle the nation's race, sex, and gendered narratives of national femininity that conventionally prioritize an elite and exclusive subject position. It is notable, too, that her construction as a mother unsettles the most abject portraits linked to Black femininity in the American consciousness. Similarly, critical resources in the New Southern Studies related to the Global South, along with Black and Africana studies discourses such as Afrofuturism, enable critical and theoretical thinking about the complex geographies and temporalities linked to Rosa Parks, not only in relation to the time and place of her original activism, that is to say, Montgomery, Alabama, a southern city, but also analyzing how she has continued to be globalized as an emblem of national femininity and beacon of civil and human rights as her legacy has been institutionalized from national to regional and local contexts in the new millennium. Parks and presidents. The original bus on which Parks was arrested, the number 2857 GM, has been restored and is on display at the Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. The bus's permanent exhibition near Detroit, a city identified with automobile manufacturing and nicknamed the Motor City, seems most appropriate. The biographical film, The Rosa Parks Story, directed by Julie Dash, who was at the time best known for the 1991 independent film Daughters of the Dust, is based on the 1991 autobiography that Parks authored with Jim Haskins, My Story, and tells the story of Parks' life from her early childhood until the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott. In one of its earliest scenes, the film recreates the iconic black and white photograph that shows Parks seated on a bus for the first time after her courageous stance in 1955, a moment that mediates her journey back in time to the period of her childhood as she begins her education at Miss White School in Montgomery. The iconicity of the original photo adds to the realism of the scene. Similarly, the image captured of President Barack Obama sitting on this famous bus in the same seat where Parks' original photo was staged in 1956 and reenacting her original pose of looking out the window links President Obama to her legacy, demonstrating its citationality and iterability. It frames him in relation to civil rights and freedom struggles in much the same way as moments such as his Obama for America campaign's choice to feature his speech at the 2008 Democratic National Convention on the 45th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King's speech at the March on Washington, and most recently, his use of King's Bible during the 2013 second-term inauguration have emphasized such linkages in the nation's cultural imaginary. The photograph stages an imaginative, visceral, and vicarious encounter with Parks so that he, at least in a symbolic sense, is on the bus with Rosa Parks and becomes legible as one of the beneficiaries of her legacy, including the historic Montgomery bus boycott and the larger struggle for civil rights. Rita Dove, U.S. Poet Laureate, Rita Dove, of course, has written a very important book entitled On the Bus with Rosa Parks, whose title was inspired by her daughter. His visualization in relation to one of the most significant cultural artifacts and museum installations related to Rosa Parks links him to the maternal and female-centered narrative of civil rights history and activist legacy associated with her, inasmuch as his invocations of Dr. King link him to the long history of the civil rights discourse that primarily authorizes Black masculine leaders associated with a prophetic tradition to speak and lead in the nation's public sphere. A discourse that has routinely obscured the voice and contributions of Black female civil rights heroines such as Rosa Parks. At the same time, some of his most vocal critics have raised questions about what is at stake and repeated implications of civil rights legacies in his administration. This photo, as some of you may remember, was also critiqued when it was released on the 57th anniversary of the Montgomery bus boycott. And it had been taken like the year before when President Obama visited the museum in Dearborn, Michigan, as a reflection of Obama's ego. And so that's another important thing to know. Furthermore, President Obama's photographic paean to Parks, who was named in 1999 by Time magazine among the 20 most influential and powerful people of the 20th century, is only one of the most recent of her recurring alignments with the presidential and the nation's public sphere, and imaging invested with even deeper symbolic significance given his status as the first Black president in the nation's history. The very fact of his presidency, given his identification as a Black man, notwithstanding his status as a mixed-race man descended from a white American mother and a Black king and father, enunciates and reconstitutes his body as Black while thoroughly unsettling the long-standing and conventional purist, nativist, and racialist definition of the nation's highest office as a prerogative of white elite men exclusively in the sense theorized by Dana D. Nelson in her groundbreaking study, National Manhood, Capitalist Citizenship and the Imagined Fraternity of White Men. When considering the definitional status of Black men as other to this privileged category grounded in notions of white masculine fraternity, traceable back to the late 18th century when the nation initially consolidated as a republic, a time when Black subjects were constituted as inferior and subhuman within Enlightenment discourses, Obama presents a refreshing contradiction and exception to the conventional race, class, and gendered logic of presidentialism in the U.S. Obama, as president, has revised the conventional grammar book on gender that casts Black men as other, alien, and subordinate within the nation's power structure and incompatible with its top leadership position. All of this is significant, too, when considering presidentialism as the ultimate kind of elitist club that also conventionally excludes, alienates, and marginalizes women by default, regardless of race, gender, and class status. Whether Obama's presidency in the long run will be pronounced as simply a brief inversion rather than erosion of the prevailing ideologies related to presidentialism as read by Nelson remains to be seen. Yet, as the nation's first black male president, his iconic imaging in a space associated with Parks and literally sitting in a space that signifies in the nation's consciousness as her seat is both deeply significant and highly subversive to the extent that it dramatizes him paying homage to her leadership legacy and affirms her as a revered and authoritative cultural figure in his eyes from his point of view and from where he sits in his public role as the nation's president. Through this gesture, Obama reifies and extends the scripts of Parks as a symbolic mother in the nation and her association with national femininity. His black masculine subject position erupts and reconfigures the prevailing white masculine gender prerogatives associated with presidentialism and reflects and extends the recurrent ways in which her black feminine body in her life and since her death has troubled the race and gendered significations of this paradigm in the nation's public sphere while challenging the dominant notions of national femininity. During her lifetime, Rosa Parks received her two most salient public honors under the administration of President Bill Clinton, beginning with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor, on September 9, 1996. As the New York Times reported, weather conditions in the wake of Hurricane Fran had blocked the roads to the Capitol, acknowledging that, quote, it was a challenge for the 11 winners of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, this country's highest civilian honor, to get to the White House for the ceremony yesterday. But they all managed to make it, except Rosa Parks. Unable to participate in the public ceremony with the 11 other recipients, Clinton presented her medal to her individually in the Oval Office at the White House a week later in a moment captured on a photograph that has now become iconic in representations. Yet, while they are positioned in the space of the Oval Office, the space and cultural memory of the bust loom large as Parks stands beside Clinton, wearing the medal and holding the accompanying framed certificate, and he smiles at her admiringly. It is an imaging that links him to one of the most salient and revered figures in civil rights history, and at the same time reinforces popular constructions that typically associate him with a liberal sensibility and empathy for blacks. Later that evening, he escorted her on to the annual dinner of the Congressional Black Caucus. This award registered her in the company of a distinguished pantheon of the nation's most distinguished leaders and cultural figures, including President George Washington, the honor's first recipient, who is often scripted as a symbolic father in the nation. Similarly, President Clinton also played the most salient public role in Parks' awarding of a Congressional Gold Medal of Freedom. Sponsored by Republican Senator Spencer Abraham from Michigan and Democratic Representative Julia Carson of Indiana, the legislation passed unanimously in the House, was opposed with one dissenting vote by Representative Ron Paul in Congress, and was signed into law by President Bill Clinton in 1999, a year during which Parks had been a highlighted guest at his State of the Union address. During the public ceremony on June 15, 1999, President Clinton frames Parks in relation to the global struggle for democracy and freedom, describing her struggle as, quote, the quintessential story of the 20th century. The personal reflections that he incorporates in his statement are particularly noteworthy, which detail how he and his friends responded to the problem of segregated buses in the U.S. South. Quote, when Rosa Parks got on that bus in Alabama, I was a 9-year-old boy living in Arkansas, going to segregated schools, riding public buses every single day where all the colored people sat in the back. My family got a television when I was 9 years old, just a few months before it became worldwide news that Mrs. Parks had gotten on the bus. I thought it was a pretty good deal, and so did my friends, and we couldn't figure out anything we could do since we couldn't even vote. So we began to sit on the back of the bus when we got on. At a rhetorical level, Clinton's public remarks are also significant for acknowledging that, quote, Parks brought America home to our founder's dream. He frames Parks' distinct contribution in keeping with people lacking position yet possessing courage and character in relation to major leaders in U.S. history, including multiple presidents extending back to Abraham Lincoln. Quote, you know, when we look across the history of the civil rights movement, we celebrate President Lincoln. and the Congress of that era for constitutional amendments. We celebrate William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. In our own period, we celebrate President Eisenhower and sending the troops to Little Rock, the commitment of John and Robert Kennedy, the magnificent legislative achievements of President Johnson and that Congress, reaching across party lines. Invoking the founders in his reflections, Clinton fundamentally means the nation's founding fathers, among whom were numbered some of the nation's earliest presidents. It is a narrative that, by implication, helps to further consolidate the image of Parks and the nation as a reigning mother figure, given her exceptional status as a female within the litany of men that he mentions in his comments. In this phrasing, he connects Parks' struggle for freedom to the overarching struggle for democracy in the nation. Her acceptance remarks, in which she states, "We thank you, I thank you. This medal is encouragement for all of us to continue until all people have equal rights," notably links her award to a larger community with whom she feels it is shared within a collective and continuing freedom struggle. The presence of Strom Thurmond at the ceremony is noteworthy in light of his famous support of Southern segregationist Dixiecrat policies, to the point of famously filibustering nonstop for a record 24 hours and 18 minutes in opposition to the Civil Rights Act of 1957 and later opposition to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. For the civil rights agendas and causes linked to prominent figures such as Rosa Parks were among those that he most vehemently opposed and worked to undermine. The irony was unmistakable. In this context, he both represents times gone by and how times have changed. In the months after his death, the revelation that he had a sexual relationship with his family's black maid named Carrie Butler and fathered an interracial daughter with her, Essie Mae Washington Williams, for whom he provided financially for years and also educated in spite of failing to acknowledge her publicly, made his racialized and polarizing politics seem particularly ironic. And of course, as many of you may have heard, Mrs. Essie Mae Washington Williams passed on this week. It's a very sad news. The several details outlined in the official act to authorize the President to award a gold medal on behalf of the Congress to Rosa Parks in recognition of her contributions to the nation and is outlined in Public Law 106-26 on May 4, 1999, both link her to the mother metaphor and clarify her national impact. The most distinguished honors that she has been accorded as a public figure, that she was accorded during her life as a public figure, such as the Presidential Medal of Freedom and the Congressional Gold Medal of Honor, I suggest, increased her legibility in the U.S. public sphere, reinforced her long-standing visibility and popularity on the global stage, and in effect, linked Parks with national femininity in the U.S. even more profoundly. Whereas assessments regarding the cultural significance and contribution of Rosa Parks have frequently been discordant at the local community level, they are amazingly consistent at the national level of politics and within the vanguard of presidential leadership. In some instances, implications of Rosa Parks in the contemporary public sphere have even tacitly served as a unifying force across political party lines and a site upon which to establish common political ground. The discourses related to Rosa Parks have become a salient metaphor at the national level and increasingly serviceable in the millennial era for articulating investments in freedom, social justice, and human rights among liberal as well as conservative presidential leaders whose views about how to enable and protect such values have nevertheless often conflicted. Her iconicity in life, which I am suggesting, was only reinforced and more thoroughly nationalized through her most salient public honors, linked her centrally to national femininity. However, as much as this narrative of Rosa Parks began to coalesce during her lifetime, it has expanded exponentially and become all the more influential and authoritative since her death. I suggest that it even more saliently frames her as an emblem of the national feminine and a symbolic mother in the nation. Her further embodiment as a model of national femininity was clear when she lay in repose posthumously on the nation's capital. President George W. Bush was centrally figured within this public commemoration of Parks and issued a proclamation that flags at U.S. public buildings in the nation and around the world be flown at half-staff the day of her funeral and burial in Detroit. Several aspects of Parks' public mourning, including her honoring on the Capitol Rotunda in a space typically reserved for presidential memorials, her floral arrangements from President Bush, and his attendance at the ceremony in the Rotunda, and Bill Clinton's remarks at the Detroit Memorial, I want to suggest, iterated the several public encounters with presidentialism that had crystallized during her lifetime. Her final repose on the Capitol in a space reserved primarily for U.S. presidents also punctuated a revolutionary life, and in an altogether different way from her subversive resistance in 1955, also unsettled forms of white elite masculine hegemony, including the nation's race and gendered ideology of presidentialism. If her decision to be arrested on a Montgomery, Alabama city bus in 1955 catalyzed the Montgomery bus boycott, launched an international movement for civil rights, and became a defining moment in her life, after her death on October 24, 2005, nearly 50 years later, Rosa Parks also made history when her body lay in repose in Washington, D.C. on the Capitol Rotunda, where mainly white men have been honored in U.S. history. In the nation's history, this honor has typically been reserved for military officers, elected officials, and U.S. presidents, among them Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, and Ronald Reagan. That Rosa Parks' body lay in repose on the Capitol Rotunda was yet another revolutionary moment in her history, to the extent that a woman lying in honor had been unprecedented until that time. The ritual of her public mourning not only in effect integrated the space on the basis of race, given her status as the second African American honored there, but also in light of her status as the very first woman. While the verb sitting is invoked and most frequently as a descriptor for the action in her heroic choice on the bus in 1955, it is notable that the verb lying emerges as the primary signifier to describe her repose at the Capitol Rotunda in a space not typically linked to black or feminine subjects, and to punctuate the ending of her revolutionary life. U.S. Representative John Conyers of Detroit, Michigan, for whom she worked as a secretary and receptionist in his congressional office in Detroit from 1965 until her retirement in 1988, spearheaded the effort to secure permission to accord Parks the distinction of lying in honor, which was granted by Senate Concurrent Resolution 61, 109th Congress, first session on October 29, 2005. The two-day public viewing of Parks on the Capitol Rotunda on October 30th and 31st began with a brief congressional ceremony during which President George W. Bush placed a wreath at her casket. The Morgan State University Choir sang the battle hymn of the Republic, and Senate Chaplain Barry C. Black remarked that, quote, Parks' courage ignited a movement that aroused our national conscience and served as an example of the power of faithful small acts. The long line to enter the rotunda extended for several blocks. From senior citizens to parents with small children, an estimated 30,000 people, some of whom were tearful, filed by quietly for hours to view the casket on display. The casket was flanked by a military honor guard at both ends during the period that it was on display. Many had traveled long distances to be a part of this historic and unprecedented moment on the nation's capital to pay tribute to Parks. The memorial services and public viewings that were held for Parks in 3 cities, including Montgomery, Alabama, Detroit, Michigan, and Washington, D.C., spanned 5 days, yielded an outpouring of public support, and magnified the deep respect and adoration for Parks throughout the nation and around the world. Her family and friends attended all of them, and to facilitate the extensive traveling during this period, her casket and family members and friends were transported to the various cities on an airplane that was volunteered by Southwest Airlines. In death, the traversal of her body across these multiple geographies reflected the national significance of Parks as a leader in the civil rights movement, and her personal history as a woman who was born in Alabama, migrated to Detroit, and transformed the nation. Reportedly, and this is really hard for me to think about always, it really drives it home in so many ways. When initially airborne and transporting Parks' body from the events in Montgomery and on to the events on the Capitol, Lewis Freeman, an African American and the first black chief pilot in the nation, and the co-pilot, also an African American, circled the city and tipped the left wing of the plane while bearing Parks' body away from her hometown, never to return, signaling her final farewell. The multiple memorial ceremonies delink Parks' legacy from a mooring in just one geographical location and point to her widespread cultural significance. In Montgomery, about 500 mourners, including Reverend Jesse Jackson, Reverend Al Sharpton, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, and Alabama Governor Bob Riley, attended the October 30th memorial for Parks at St. Paul AME Church, the church to which Parks belonged as a member when she was arrested in 1955. Parks' casket was surrounded by pink, white, and yellow floral arrangements. Notably, at the service, Montgomery Mayor, then Mayor, Bobby Bright commented on the notion of a pardon for Parks by remarking that, quote, "You can't pardon someone who has done nothing wrong, and I ask for Mrs. Parks to pardon us." Rice commented that, quote, "I think I can say that without Mrs. Parks, I would not be standing here today as Secretary of State. Not only did she set off a revolution of freedom and a second round of emancipation here in the United States, but she is also revered around the world." And I'll just skip ahead a bit because I have some specific comments about the Detroit service. In Detroit, floral arrangements and enlarged photos surrounded the casket as two sheriff's deputies wearing white gloves stood at opposite ends where Parks lay in repose at Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History prior to a service at Greater Grace Temple on November 2nd. The service, which was also broadcast live on C-SPAN, drew 4,000 mourners and ended up lasting 7 hours, a full day, and several hours longer than the program originally scheduled. Among the speakers were Senator Barack Obama and President Bill Clinton, and the service also featured a performance by soul legend Aretha Franklin. Bill Clinton remarked that, quote, "The world knows of Rosa Parks because of a single simple act of dignity and courage that struck a lethal blow to the foundations of legal bigotry." Similarly, the pastor, Bishop Charles Ellis III, remarked, quote, "Certainly, Mrs. Parks was bigger than her family. She was bigger than her church family. She belonged to the whole world." After the service, an American flag was draped over Parks' casket, which was transported in an antique, gold-trimmed, horse-drawn carriage on a 7-mile procession well, not for the entire procession because of the timing. It was actually transported back to a hearse and then driven on, but initially it was placed in this antique gold-trimmed casket. To Detroit's Woodlawn Cemetery, where her body was interred in the mausoleum where her husband and mother were also buried. From the participation of a singer such as Aretha Franklin and the horse-drawn carriage in a processional to an honor guard that carried her body to the cemetery, aspects of this Detroit ceremony, the culminating memorial in the monumental multi-city homegoing for Rosa Parks, recalled aspects of the regal funeral for Annie Johnson, famously featured in the 1959 film version of Imitation of Life. This film featured gospel singer Mahalia Jackson singing "Soon I Will Be Done," and a public ceremony and parade replete with bands and a horse-drawn carriage, a homegoing that Johnson had described in detail to her employer, Laura Meredith, and dreamed of having once passing on. It also recollects the aesthetics of African-American post-mortem photography featured in James Van Der Zee's classic Harlem Book of the Dead. Furthermore, several aspects of Parks' public mourning, including her honoring on the Capitol Rotunda in a space typically reserved for presidential memorials, her floral arrangements from President Bush and his attendance at the ceremony in the Rotunda, and Bill Clinton's remarks at her Detroit memorial, I want to suggest, iterated the alignments with presidentialism that had crystallized during her lifetime when she received the distinction of the Presidential Medal of Honor and met with Bill Clinton in the Oval Office at the White House. The scale of this extraordinary public memorial and the 3 geographies where her memorial services were held reflected Parks' background as a native of Pine Level, Alabama, and the years that she lived in Montgomery, her eventual move to Detroit that aligned her with the phenomenon of the great migration of African Americans from southern states to the urban north, and her status as a reigning symbol of the civil rights movement that crystallized in the wake of the boycott, galvanized by her choice not to give up her seat on the bus in 1955. This struggle centrifugally catalyzed movements for freedom and human rights around the world and has continued to be an inspiration. Rosa Parks' iconicity since the Civil Rights era has framed her as a primary black feminine figure in globalizing the civil rights movement that emerged in the segregated South and in constituting a discourse on black femininity in national and global contexts. Parks emerged as a site of mourning and recollection related to the civil rights movement across sites from Montgomery to Detroit, with the nation's capital as the focal point on the map of the national celebration of her life. Her funeral before the world and the enshrining of her body on the Capitol Rotunda recollected the civil rights movement within national memory and memorialized her before an audience of international proportions. During this time of mourning, Parks emerged as the quintessential emblem of the national body on the Capitol. In a figurative sense, she became synonymous with notions of national femininity in the U.S. in the wake of her loss. In her long-standing honored designation as the mother of the civil rights movement, a maternal metaphor has mediated this script of Parks in the cultural imaginary to the point that she was coined as a Black Madonna in the years after her arrest. A Montgomery City Councilman, Luther Oliver, dubbed her Saint Rosa. Indeed, the metaphor of Parks as the movement's mother in a symbolic and representative sense within discourses of the civil rights movement has complemented the movement's recurrent narratives invoking children, which reached their rhetorical height in Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech during the March on Washington in 1963. Her status as a woman who was never a literal birth or adoptive mother to a child has made her imaginable as mythic and universal mother in civil rights discourse and facilitated her abstraction as a nurturer of an infinite variety of causes in the global context related to human rights. The period of mourning Parks' body on the Capitol Rotunda enshrined and literalized her status as a reigning symbol of national femininity. Her figuring as a symbolic mother momentarily united the nation within a race, sex, and gender discourse, scripting Parks as a maternal figure, constituting a narrative of Americans as a diverse national family. To some extent, it was grounded in Parks' background as a youth mentor and her continuing investment in children's rights. Indeed, Parks' work with the movement itself was widely studied, memorialized. Wait a minute. I lost my place here. Parks. All right, forget it. I just actually have some images that I want to survey briefly. This is the unveiling of the postage stamp, which I had no idea I would also be invited to participate in, but I am certainly deeply honored to have been a participant in. And so this is the image from Tuesday morning's Montgomery Advertiser that shows the postmaster in Montgomery and Georgette Norman, the director of the Rosa Parks Museum in Montgomery, who's also a dear friend of mine and mentor in the world of the arts, alongside this beautiful stamp. And I was also given a framed display of the stamps, as well as one of the beautiful silk-screened prints produced by the really children at the museum in keeping with the mobile art studio. It's a project that I actually urge everybody who would be interested to get involved in. The centerpiece program of the Rosa Parks Museum to celebrate Rosa Parks' birthday is a project entitled Rosa Parks' 100th Birthday Wishes, which solicited wishes from children and youth primarily related to what they would want ideally for their city, for their nation, for their world. And so these wishes have been coming in now from literally everywhere, and there are about 1,600 now. And they've been basically painted on and silk screened onto these just remarkable handmade pieces of paper that children have made. And then the idea is to install them in the offices of officials around Montgomery, and ideally too to translate them into measurable actions. And in the wake of Rosa Parks' 100th birthday, this project has actually been extended to mirror the 381 days of the Montgomery bus boycott. And so now the deadline has been extended to November 18th. So, school children are urged to send in their wishes. They can send them to Georgette Norman at gmnorman@troy.edu. But parents, urge your children, please, not to be left out of this project. This is a very historic and important project. Teachers, just everybody who would be interested, I urge you to send in your wishes. And this is an example of one of the silk screens. they're very striking, as you can see. This is the article that I produced and presented that night at the celebration. The title is Rosa Parks, whose no in 1955 launched the Montgomery bus boycott and was heard around the world. And so I presented this quilt Monday night, and it is now going to be added to the permanent collection at the Rosa Parks Museum. It, as you may be able to tell, is pretty obvious here, but it recreates and reinterprets that famous arrest photo of Rosa Parks that I mentioned earlier. And this is actually a photo taken of the National Book Award recipient Nikki Finney, Georgette Norman, and me in the lobby of the Rosa Parks Museum. In front of us, you can see this beautiful statue and then the mural in the background. Along with figures such as Coretta Scott King, Rosa Parks is a primary woman through whom the civil rights movement has been nationalized and globalized, beginning with her 1955 arrest for not giving up her seat while she served as secretary of the NAACP, her role in inspiring the Montgomery bus boycott, and her support of the Browder versus Gale civil case filed by Fred Gray in U.S. District Court in February of 1956. This famous case challenged the constitutionality of bus segregation and involved multiple plaintiffs, including Aurelia Browder, Claudette Colvin, Susie McDonald, and Mary Louise Smith, all of whom had been mistreated on Montgomery buses. The outcome was the integration of the buses. The Montgomery bus boycott inspired similar boycotts to challenge segregation on public buses in a range of other southern towns and cities, whose logical extension was the freedom rise of the early 1960s, and it lay at the core of a much larger movement for civil, women's, and human rights that unfolded from the mid-1950s through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, whose impact has continually been felt. In 2013, the marking of important dates in civil rights history, from Rosa Parks' centennial birthday to the 50th anniversary of the horrific bombing at 16th Street Baptist Church, is a reminder of the traumas and scars of the past, and yet a testament to our endurance in this new millennium. I stand with all who honor Rosa Parks and salute her genius and her beautiful legacy with the deepest respect, appreciation, and admiration. Thank you so much.